Hello, everyone. We are going to give it just a few more minutes here until people get logged on, and then we will go ahead and begin. Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here, whether it's through Zoom, live on YouTube, or a watch group. We are delighted to have you with us here for the official launch of A Brave and Lovely Woman by Mark Borthwick. My name is Carrie Rademacher. I'm the executive director here at Taliesin Preservation, and we are coming to you live tonight from Taliesin. Couple of housekeeping things. If you move on your screen, you will see there's two features, a Q&A and a chat. After the presentation, we will allow time for the audience to ask questions of Mark. So if you have any questions that you are thinking of, whether now or during his presentation, feel free to enter those into the Q&A component. Our team, our communications team here tonight with us, Elizabeth Mask and Susan Kennedy, will be moderating and watching those chats. And then once Mark is done with his presentation, we will go ahead and share those questions and allow Mark to answer whatever questions you might have. Additionally, there is a chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to enter in the chat feature, maybe a hello and where you're coming from tonight. So getting ready for this, we would like to thank the University of Wisconsin Press for co-hosting this event with us tonight. And a very special thank you to Allison Shea and Casey Lavella for their assistance in tonight's event. Events like this are made possible by our generous donors. To make a donation and to buy a signed copy of A Brave and Lovely Woman, please visit our website at taliesinpreservation.org. It is the only place where you can get a signed book from Mark. So that being said, and without further ado, please allow me to introduce the author and special guest of tonight, Mark Borthwick. Mark, hello.
Hello, and thank you, Carrie. Thank you very much. And really thanks to everyone at Taliesin Preservation. And I should say thanks also to the University of Wisconsin Press. They have really done a beautiful job on this book. My chief aim in writing it was to show who Mama Borthwick was in and of herself. An extraordinary woman, and at the same time, examine her importance for Frank Lloyd Wright. And also, I wanted to look at how possibly she had responded to what we think of as modernism in that era. The title, Brave and Lovely Woman, is how Wright described her. I realize that as a book title, it sounds as though it may idealize her. I don't think it does, but she has been surrounded by a kind of distortion field in fiction and sensational accounts. The real person is much more interesting. And I like to think that our better understanding of her might help us understand Wright a little more. I am her relative, a distant cousin. The family connection helped a little with some facts and photos, but not as much as I would have wished. Just to start with basic facts, Mema was born in Boone, Iowa in 1869. Her parents were from opposite sides of the Mason-Dixon line. Her mother was from Charlottesville, Virginia. Her father was from Albany, New York. They met in Iowa, but they were married in Memphis, Tennessee, just after the Civil War began. I explain a little about that in the book, but it's something of a mystery. She was the youngest of 4 children. She had 2 sisters, Lizzie and Jessie, and a brother, Frank, the oldest. Her given name was Mary. Mema very soon became all she was known by. Her family was middle class, and they moved from Iowa to Chicago in the 1870s, and then to the suburb of Oak Park around 1880. So she started living in Oak Park some years before Frank Lloyd Wright did. He didn't move there until 1888. They didn't meet until around 1901. The book has a chapter about her at the age of 16, and she was a remarkable 16-year-old, adventurous, seems to have been a talented actress in high school. She started at the University of Michigan in 1888, and she was an excellent student. The literature department chairman said he considered her to be among the top of her class academically, especially in languages, and especially good at expressing herself. And she was also among the most popular in the class. Here's a photograph of her with some of her classmates in 1862. A minute. And I'll try to get this slideshow going. Are you seeing that? I hope you are.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. There she is. All right. If you're seeing that, excuse that little flub. That is Mema there in the upper left circled, and that gentleman to the lower right of her is her future husband, Edwin Cheney. He is about the same year she is. He joined her class rather late, but he managed to make it just in time for that graduation photograph. Anyway, photographs of Mema are relatively rare. And in all of them, she looks somewhat different than any other. Ed Cheney was from Detroit. He may have been courting her by then. Whether or not he was, as we'll see, she was in no hurry at all to marry him, or anyone else for that matter. His interests were really not much overlapping with hers. She was a literature major with an emphasis on languages, studied Latin and classical Greek, and she was gifted in languages. She spoke German and French very well, and some Italian. She had a strong interest in art and art history also. It's clear she was popular in the class because in her senior year, they elected her to its highest honor, which was not based on academics. It was the title Class Seer, S-E-E-R. It meant that she would be the one to write and deliver a speech known as the prophecy at the commencement ceremony. Traditionally, it was tongue-in-cheek kind of speech about the future of people in the class. Hers was that kind of speech, but it broke with tradition slightly because it skewered a few male egos of the class. Obviously, she wasn't afraid to be witty in a challenging way in public with men. Believe it or not, on the far left of this group is the same woman. This is Mema, just a year later. She's no longer that wonkish-looking lit and language major at Michigan. She's beginning here to join a new level of society. This is when she joined the sorority Kappa Alpha Theta at its national convention in Chicago in 1893. It was the most prestigious national sorority, and she had been invited to join by the sorority's alumni who were impressed by her. She became prominent in Kappa Alpha Theta nationally. For example, in 1907, she was the toastmistress of its banquet at its national convention. This is a close-up of her in a larger group of women from the University of Michigan. And somewhere in that group was her very close friend, Mattie Chadbourne. Maybe that's her standing next to Mema, I don't know. She was a year behind Mema at Michigan. They were roommates. She's an important part of Mema's story. They were close all through their school years at Michigan and well beyond. Mema stayed on a year at the University of Michigan to earn a master's degree, and then she and Mattie became high school teachers in Port Huron, Michigan. But after they'd been there for 2 years, Mattie became ill. There's no indication of what her illness was, but it was serious. She had to resign and leave Port Huron and return to her parents in Iowa. So Mema decided to leave Port Huron at the same time. She returned to her home in Oak Park, and by then Edwin Cheney was living in Oak Park. He was a business executive, and he was rising fast in the business world that installed the new electric grid for Chicago. He had moved to Oak Park after graduation, probably in anticipation of her coming back there. She began teaching high school in the nearby suburb of Riverside. And it's around this time, the late 1890s, that we have the first clear photograph of her. As I said, no photograph of her looks much like the others. This was taken in Oak Park by her friend, Lily Wiltberger, who was trying to set herself up in her mother's home as a studio photographer. It's an old-fashioned profile, which is odd. The hair is slightly askew on top. I think she had this photograph taken dutifully for Edwin when they became engaged. Yeah, she finally agreed to marry him, and they were married in 1899, just before Mema turned 30. Years later, this photo was obtained by newspapers and altered by newsroom artists to project what they assumed she looked like at an older age. By late 1902, she'd become pregnant. They were renting a house in Oak Park, and maybe the prospect of their first child made them decide they needed a house of their own. So Edwin commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright to design a house. It's been assumed that the house is how Mema and Wright first met. As we'll see, it's not how they met. Frank Lloyd Wright, at the age of 34, was good-looking, debonair, probably charismatic. In the book, I describe why he is likely to have met Mema around 1901 at an Oak Park golf club called Westward Ho, where they both were members. She played golf. I don't think he did. For him, the club social events were a good way to network and get clients. In 1911, he told reporters that Edwin introduced them at a social event. I believe it was one held at the golf club. He described the moment of their meeting as electrical for both of them. In any case, Cheney House is not how they met. Here's what Cheney House looks like in Oak Park today. I think it's true that they spent a good deal of time together designing and building it, and surely that must have helped kindle their affair. That was in 1903 and 1904. Much has been said of how secretive it looks from the street. I wonder if that's why Wright biographer Meryl Seacrest imagined that Mama was reclusive, but of course she wasn't. She was a vivacious, popular member of the Oak Park community. She loved to host parties. The open, integrated interior of the main living area of Cheney House allowed her to host surprisingly large parties in what is a modest size house. I was in Cheney House a long time ago on one of the Wright Plus tours. I was thrilled with it, of course. I'm sorry there isn't really time to talk about it. The book has a chapter on it. And so their affair developed from there. By 1908, things were becoming pretty intense for them. 1908 is the year before Wright abandoned Oak Park and his practice to go to Europe with Mama. There's been mostly more questions and answers about that time of his life. It's been said that his decision to go was rather impulsive and spontaneous, but it wasn't really. It has to be seen over a 2-year period, 1908, 1909. Wright admitted that he didn't understand himself in that period, wasn't sure what he should do next. He just knew that he really wanted to get away. As for Mama, there's also a sign in 1908 of how unhappy and restless she'd become. She wrote a comedy play titled Woman of the Hour, and she had the lead role in it when it was performed for the local women's club. The play was clever, and parts of it were quoted at length in the local newspaper. It was very sarcastic about marriage, which reflected her sort of dissatisfaction in marriage. By this time, she was interested in serious theater, especially the modern drama coming out of Europe that realistically depicted women. She also had a very strong interest in the modern novel. And in late 1908, she enrolled in a course at the University of Chicago on how to write a modern novel, taught by a prominent novelist, Robert Herrick. The big surprise in my research on this period was discovering an event in 1908 that may have helped force their decision to leave. There's a chapter on it. I call it the Wisconsin Road Trip. It was a 3-day car trip in August 1908, up into and across Wisconsin, and finally back to Oak Park. The passengers in the car were Wright, Mama, Edwin, and believe it or not, Edwin's mother, Armilla, who was in her early 60s. Wright didn't have a car in 1908, but Edwin did. He had sold his 1906 Cadillac touring car and bought a new touring car of some make. If that sounds like a luxurious kind of car, well, here is an example of a touring car. This is a 1908 Packard touring car, considered a very high-end car at the time. 4 people traveling for 3 days on unpaved roads cross-country in 1908 in a vehicle like this would have been not just an adventure, I'd say it would have been an achievement. The ostensible purpose of the trip was to visit Wright's lakeside vacation house designed for his friend, Roby Lamp. I wonder whose idea the trip was, Wright's or Mama's. Doesn't matter really. Obviously, it gave them a chance to be together for 3 days away from his wife, Catherine. And this was just asking for trouble. Here's their itinerary based on the main roads in 1908. First northwest to Madison and Lake Mendota, to see Wright's project on the water for his friend. It was called Rocky Roost, then east to Milwaukee and down to Racine, where they almost certainly would have stopped to see his fine house there overlooking Lake Michigan, Thomas P. Hardy House, and then back down to Oak Park. Rocky Roost was their first stop, where they stayed overnight. A rather precarious looking house no longer exists. After that, they drove to Milwaukee and apparently stayed overnight in a hotel. And then to Racine and Hardy House, where they would have stopped before heading back to Oak Park. This is a rare 1908 photo of Hardy House. It shows the house draped with an American flag, and this may be exactly what the touring party saw from the street. Thanks, by the way, to Eric O'Malley and the OAND archive for sharing this photograph. Frank and Mama may have taken advantage of Edwin's being preoccupied, attending to his mother or dealing with the car. We have to use our imaginations, but there may well have been some kind of incident that gave them away, at least enough to make them aware that they'd aroused suspicion. Because we know that right after that road trip, they decided to meet with their spouses, the four of them together in Wright's living room, and they came out with the truth. Of course, Edwin and Catherine must have been outraged, but then they argued and insisted that Frank and Mama wait a year before doing anything drastic, and they agreed. But all that really meant was that the two households were in limbo for a year. Wright had 6 children in all, most of them still at home. The Cheney household was larger than you might think. It included 3 children, a governess, and Mama's sister Lizzie. She had lived with them from before Cheney House was built. She had helped raise Mama's 2 children from when they were born, and she helped raise their niece. Their sister Jessie had died in childbirth in 1901, and Mama and Lizzie had raised her. Here is Jessie on the terrace of Cheney House, reading to Mama's children, John and Martha, on each side. This photo is from around 1912. Mama's sister Lizzie seems to have been very motherly. She was especially close to Jessie, who later cared for her in her old age. Lizzie was a school teacher, never married. And truth is, she was an enabler for Mama's decision, a very reluctant enabler. Mama said that without Lizzie being there in Cheney House to serve as a surrogate mother, it would have been impossible for her to leave her children. Mama finally left Edwin and Oak Park forever in June 1909. She took the 3 children with her and went to Boulder, Colorado, where her friend Mattie was living. Mattie was about to have her 3rd child. And here we come to one of the enduring derogatory myths about Maba. It's said that in the fall she walked down on her children, left them there in Boulder, and ran away with Wright, telling Edwin to come get them. That certainly didn't happen. At the end of the summer, Edwin went to Colorado to retrieve the children because 2 of them had to start school on September 6th in Oak Park. Mama handed them over to him, a difficult moment for her, I'm sure. There's plenty of evidence that she did love them. Anyway, she stayed in Boulder until Mattie had given birth to a healthy child, a girl, on September 23rd. And then she left and met Wright in Chicago, and they went to New York and ultimately to Berlin. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over much of what's in the book about their experience in Europe. It's well known that Wright found it to be a very important time for him. And so we can ask, how relevant was Mema to his experience? Well, I'm sure she was significant. She probably encouraged him to go to Europe in the first place when he was considering it. She had been to Europe twice before with Edwin. Wright never had been to Europe. And once they were there together, she must have been a great help to him. She knew her way around, so to speak. She spoke German, French, Italian, none of which he spoke. Now, of course, he was very self-directed. He did travel on his own a number of times without her. But Mema's own European experience began almost from the very start as an emotional crisis. And this was because immediately after they arrived, she learned that her dear friend Mattie had died in Boulder after Mema had left her. The cause of her death isn't clear, probably connected to the birth of her child. On top of that terrible news, the awful reality that she'd created for herself finally hit her full force. Having given up her children, she'd lost so much, and she'd become an outcast. In one of her letters, she said she felt she had entered a darkness. She was often depressed and full of doubt while she was in Europe. What saved her and kept her afloat psychologically was that she came across a book by the Swedish feminist Ellen Key. Last name spelled K-E-Y, but it's pronounced K. The book was probably the one titled Love and Marriage, written in German. It makes common sense to most people today about marriage, but it was pretty revolutionary thinking for its time. Ellen Key was 60 years old when Mema encountered her, and she was a brilliant woman. She was known all over Europe, wide-ranging philosopher, an advocate of legal reforms to improve the conditions for women. Among other things, she argued that divorce should be made much easier and that a married person who was very unhappy in marriage had every right to leave it. So Mema became an instant disciple of Ellen Key's, and she went to Sweden to meet her. Key really became her mentor. In fact, she said Key came to treat her like a daughter, and Mema became Key's translator. Sometimes I refer to something Mema wrote. It's one of her letters to Ellen Key. In the summer of 1910, Mema and Frank Lloyd Wright lived in Italy, in this wonderful spot high in the hills overlooking Florence. They had a small house with a garden in the ancient town of Fiesole. And while they were there that summer, she worked on translations for Ellen Key. Wright worked on preparing drawings of his work for his famous Osmood portfolio with the help of an American draftsman named Taylor Woolley, who came to think the world of Mema. It was an important time for Wright. He felt the need to justify his reasons for leaving his family to be with Mema and to explore his own truth. And Ellen Key's philosophy helped him in that. All the while, of course, he was assimilating the architecture and landscape around him. They left Fiesole late that summer and traveled in Europe. It's not clear where they went, but likely Vienna, where Wright could see modern architecture. And they eventually reached Berlin, and then he left for America. Mema stayed in Berlin for 8 more months so she could complete her legal separation from Edwin. She lived here in this faculty house for an elite boys' school where she taught to support herself. The school was called the Wachenthal Gymnasium. The building is now the Berlin University of the Arts. On her return to the US in the summer of 1911, she stopped to visit Ellen Key at the wonderful house she had designed for herself on a great lake in Sweden. And then she reunited with Wright in rural Wisconsin, where he had begun to build Taliesin near Spring Green. Taliesin was a kind of high redoubt for them and a refuge that was reminiscent of what Fiesole had been. But at this point, they faced widespread public criticism for living together. They were even pilloried with this political cartoon in a Chicago newspaper. Taliesin is in the background with smoke billowing over it, marked scandal, and Miss Wisconsin tells Miss Chicago to take him back, and Miss Chicago refuses. I think this criticism changed Wright, and not for the better. The sheer extent of it was a shock to him, because he had been truly a local hero before he left. But now he was almost a pariah. His response to the criticism was pretty combative. To make matters worse, his wife refused to divorce him. Mama obtained her divorce from Edwin, and she did reunite with her children that summer. It was a long vacation with them in Canada. But the children had to return home and start school in the fall. At Taliesin, she became very busy managing workers in its construction, and Wright said that Taliesin was made for Mama. She loved the place, and she became like its resident spirit. There's a reporter's account of how she would talk and laugh with the draftsmen and workmen, and the reporter said that all the men at Taliesin became very devoted to her. Edwin Cheney quickly remarried. Mama wrote to Ellen Kay that he and his new wife were taking good care of the children. They were still helped by Lizzie, who went on living in Cheney House with them for another 2 years. It happened that Edwin's new wife was an old friend of Lizzie's. She had introduced her to Edwin. And I think that helped reduce the overall state of tension between Mama and Edwin. It seems that Mama had been given reason to think she'd be allowed to see the children more often. So we reached the year 1914. Wright was very busy with the construction of the outdoor entertainment complex he had designed, Midway Gardens in Chicago. And it kept him away from Taliesin a lot. I think many of you know what I'm coming to. An unthinkable tragedy happened at Taliesin while he was away. It was August 15th, a mass murder in which Mama was killed, along with her 2 children who had been visiting her, plus 4 workmen were killed. She was 45. Her children were 11 and 8. Her niece Jessie was fortunately not visiting Taliesin at the time. She was staying with a friend. So these were the brutal facts that Frank Lloyd Wright and Edwin Cheney had to deal with when they rushed to Taliesin, and of course they were devastated. The only image we have of the murderer, Julian Carleton, is from a courtroom photograph. And it's no more revealing in any respect than his testimony was. He was a servant, fairly new to Taliesin. His weapons were a hatchet and fire using a can of gasoline. The residential section of Taliesin was burned. Wright rebuilt it later. Carleton attempted suicide by drinking acid when he was captured. And having done that, he essentially starved to death in jail. The murders are so shocking and inexplicable that a good deal has been written about them, but without adding much. Mostly speculation in unnecessary, gruesome detail about what happened to Mama. I do provide some new information about that. There is evidence that she died trying to protect her children. But I'd like to end on a more positive note. I want to mention the photograph of Mema on the book's cover. Over her life, it's the one good view of her that we have. Here's the original photograph. It's identical, except that this shows who the photographer was. He was Chicago's premier portrait photographer, William Louis Koene. He made a great many standard photo portraits, none at all like this one. He really knew what he was doing with this. It's striking, very modern style for that time period. His signature almost never appears on a photograph, but he signed this photograph, lower left. Mema had it taken in early 1914 as a birthday gift for Wright. She left behind almost nothing, but I think this photograph is an eloquent testimonial. And so are her letters to Ellen Kay. In those, she truly is brave and lovely. The first letter in 1910 shows her courage in her struggle with her depression and uncertainty. Her later letters are full of resolution and love and devotion for Ellen Kay and Frank Lloyd Wright. She really was his soulmate. Wright wrote to Ellen Kay after Mema's death that Taliesin had given them, after all their tribulations, the quiet assurance of peace. He had a gift for that kind of phrase, a quiet assurance of peace. Mema does seem to have found that there. In his letter to Ellen Kay about Mema, he included a 3-word sentence: "We lived richly," and he underlined lived. Today, a mile from Taliesin, in his family's cemetery, those 3 words from that letter now appear in his handwriting on her gravestone. Thanks, everyone, for your attention. Thanks very much.
Mark, thank you so much. That was so fascinating. And hello to all of those who have logged on during this process. At the bottom of the screen, your screen, there is a Q&A question and answer feature. We will now take any questions that are out there from those viewers, the attendees. And so, Elizabeth, I will turn it over to you now, and you and Susan will be doing some moderating of the questions coming in, and Mark will let them ask you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Mark, for your presentation. Looks like we have a few questions in the chat. Our first question for you tonight, Mark, is from Mary. She was wondering what your most revealing discovery was when looking through the archives.
Well, I would say by far the most revealing things are Mema's letters. And I couldn't really reproduce all of them in the book. And so there are parts of them that tell us more about Mema than what I provided in the book. Really, I would say one of them, for example, is how Mema would stand up for herself when she had to. She really adored and practically worshipped Ellen Kay, but at one point when Ellen Kay criticized her and even possibly accused her of doing something without her permission, she stood right up to her. And that was a kind of surprising feature alongside the wonderful things that Mema was writing about Taliesin and about what she wanted to do with translations. It showed that Mema was a very diverse personality.
Thank you. It's kind of interesting to get some insight from those letters about Mema's personality. Our next question after all of your work, what remaining questions or mysteries or puzzles or secrets are you still thinking about?
Well, of course, I wish that I knew things that I don't think will ever be answered, because I'd like to know really what Maima's problems specifically were with Edwin and the relationship that they had as they tried to work out her departure. I'm surprised that he is non-acrimonious at her departure. And it seems to me that Edwin and she had some kind of understanding that if there were any further divorce documents or anything else, I would really like to know what that was, because I think it would tell us a lot about what happened between them.
That leads me to this question as a tie-in. Someone is wondering, if we know what happened to Edwin after 1914, and how long did he occupy the Cheney house?
I believe he was in Cheney House a few more years, but he eventually moved to St. Louis, Missouri, where he continued to work for the same electric company that he was a general manager for in Chicago. He had 2 more children, and I believe he died, I believe in the 1950s. I didn't reproduce a photograph of Edwin much later in life like that, but I have to say, when I saw it, I was struck by how profoundly unhappy he looked.
Thank you for that. We have another question about your research. What were your primary and also most obscure sources that you consulted for this book?
Well, the sources were, I would say, diverse, but you would be surprised at how many sources, and you can see this in the endnotes, came from local newspapers, which were a very different animal back then than they are today. A local newspaper was a gossip column writ large. It had everything about everyone. And so it would, even in the 1880s, have little blurbs about this 16-year-old girl named Mark Borthwick. So what I was surprised by is that I had to do this research, a great deal of it, during the pandemic. All my plans to go to archives, libraries were out the window. They were all closed. And necessity is the mother of invention. I was dumbfounded at the discovery of how much of the world has been digitized. Newspapers, archives of all kinds, not just Google Books. And so it was through the help of people who would help me look, and the advice of all kinds of people, libraries, archives, that made that possible. For example, Maima's material in the Kappa Alpha Theta archive is digitized. So that is what saved me during the pandemic, when research was so restricted.
Thank you for that. I can't imagine what that was like during the pandemic to, go through all these sources. So it's wonderful that so many were digitized. We have another question for you. How did you find out about the Wisconsin road trip?
Well, I knew that I wanted to find out anything about Maima in the year 1908, and that period running right up to her departure with Wright from Oak Park. I had no idea that it would pop up in Wisconsin, but when I searched databases of newspapers, and I looked for Frank Lloyd Wright, not Maima, in certain cases, I found this little hidden gem of a item in the Wisconsin State Journal that described the road trip, and it must have been planted there by Roby Lamp, his friend. And you know, with a little piece of information like that, which gave all the details about visiting Rocky Roost and how they were going over to Milwaukee and so forth, it's just the rest fell into place.
Wow, what a find. Here's an interesting question from Kevin. You know, in the aftermath of the tragedy at Taliesin, do you see any noticeable influence on Wright's work that you think might be attributed to that event?
You know, I do not. I have read some places that his work became more fortress-like because he, you know, sheltered himself psychologically, that sort of thing. But, you know, there's plenty to contradict that in his work. He was incredibly resilient. He knew what he was doing before then, which was going to change in his work. You could see his primitivism, you might say, that he was experimenting with. And in short, I hate to disappoint, but I think while psychologically it affected him, there's no question, I don't see how it affected his work.
No, it's great to hear your perspective on that. Thank you. Someone's wondering if the book includes any more insight into Maima's letters to Frank Lloyd Wright while they were apart.
You know, that's a good question. Of course, the full gamut of letters that Maima wrote were not preserved in the National Library of Sweden. It's not clear why. So the only letter that that is clearly written when they were apart is the first one, when she is in deep depression. This is in the fall of 1910, and she is alone without Wright in Berlin. And clearly, I don't know what she would have written to him, but she wrote to Ellen Kay that she was in near despair, and that only Ellen Kay's light, as she put it, was keeping out the darkness. But that's the only thing that I can think of. That otherwise it's hard to imagine what the correspondence was.
Thank you. Another question is, what would you suggest is the most paramount myth about Maima?
Most paramount what?
Myth.
Oh, myth. Well, one of the most repeated is the one that I mentioned, that she had left her children in Boulder, Colorado. And that was first reported in newspapers, and everybody picked it up as fact. I think the other sort of mythology had to do with just her personality. And it was assumed that she was possibly not very outgoing because during their time at Taliesin, when Wright kept holding press conferences, she didn't say a word. And I think people assumed that she was withdrawn in some way, but of course, as the book shows, she certainly was not. And so those kinds of misunderstandings are easy when there is so little information.
I imagine. On that note, you know, did it change your understanding of Wright, learning more about Maima?
Well, yes, I would say it did. I would say that in short, I now cut him a lot more slack than I used to. He had a quality about him if he loved a woman like that. And, you know, I think as we look at that relationship and how totally loyal Wright was to her, it's easy for us to criticize him in all kinds of ways. I know he created his own stereotype, which gets in the way. But when we look at the way he was so loyal, and you can see it in his letters and in every testimonial he made, there's no question that he loved her very much, and there's someone there with a conscience and a certain amount of self-awareness that I don't think we have often accorded him.
It seems like it's really like humanized, right? And
Exactly.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions. In the book, you present Maima as a woman really ahead of her time, you know, suggesting parallels between Maima's journey and progressive thinking of the time. Do you think Maima was inspired by the cultural pulse around her, and in what ways?
Inspired by the, you mean the cultural environment, you mean?
Yes.
Undoubtedly she was. Of course, she at Oak Park was translating plays of modern European drama. And those would have been the plays that interested her because they were depictions of troubled marriages. And it's clear because she was studying the modern novel in 1908 that she had been reading modern novels of that period. And they were written especially of interest to her by women. Even the year she was married, 1899, Kate Chopin's The Awakening, a great novel, was published. And so Maima was reading that sort of material. A lot of the novels of that period by women have fallen into obscurity, but then they all have a theme of discovery. And I think Maima was absolutely on top of that.
That's lovely. Thank you. It really paints a picture of her for us. Here's another one. What do you think made Wright and Maima kindred spirits?
I think that most fundamentally comes from the fact that they were both idealists. And their idealism was for her in the cause of women, for Wright in the cause of architecture. But they both recognized that idealism in one another. Of course, they had these overlapping interests in poetry. They loved the same kind of Victorian poets. And William Blake, which was a very powerful poet that they both clearly loved. I think those kind of common interests, and above all that fundamental idealism that they understood in one another, is what made them kindred spirits.
I love that. Thank you. It looks like we have time for one last question. I guess adding on to this last question, do you think their relationship would have stood the test of time?
Well, I've thought about that a lot. And yes, I do. I do because it had already stood a considerable test. The stresses that they had been through together, would have been a test for any marriage. And I'm sure, as Wright admitted, that they had their arguments. In his final letter to the community, he said as much. I think they would have been together for a very long time. Let's put it that way.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you for answering everyone's questions. I know there were a few we didn't get to, but I think we covered a lot of ground. And thank you, everyone, for your questions.
Yes, thank you all so much. Susan has put in the chat the link to being able to purchase this book. Again, we have copies here available at taliesinpreservation.org. They are the only place where you can get a signed copy by Mark Borthwick. Mark, thank you so much for writing this book, looking into the history, portraying a beautiful story of someone that for so long has been underrepresented. It truly was wonderful. And of course, wonderful meeting you and working with you and UW Press. We wish you all the best. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining. We very much appreciate you being here.
And
Good
thank
night.
you. Thank you,
Thank you.
by the way. I mean, it's been a great pleasure.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.